stand. Okay. Let's do it. Yes, we'll do it.
Okay. I can take off my mask, okay. Great.
Try that.
Okay. Do I speak directly into the
Yes,
microphone?
as close as possible.
Okay. Hello? Perfect. Amazing. Thank you, Lyndon, for reading the 10 Commandments for us. I really appreciate that. Okay. This is a smaller podium than I anticipated. Okay, so maybe this is a Christian cliche, but one of my New Year's resolutions this year was to start observing the Sabbath. This has been the first time I've ever tried doing this. When I was young, my family never practiced Sabbath, and as an adult, I've always told myself that I was too busy to be able to take an entire day off to rest. But now, for the first time, I have this designated time in my week where I just don't allow myself to do any work. Is there an assignment I forgot to do on Saturday? Well, guess it'll have to wait until tomorrow. Do I have an important email to send? Well, not today, I don't. Instead, I am making an effort to rest. For me, rest looks mostly like taking a break from my schoolwork, which is never ending, and also being more intentional about where I put my emotional energy. In the last 4 months, I've been learning that most of the things on my to-do list can wait an extra day or two. And also, and perhaps more importantly, that I don't have to let that anxious little voice in my head dictate all of my actions or my reactions. I'm not gonna lie, it's been really good. Really hard sometimes, but also really good. When I was younger, the closest I ever got to Sabbath were days spent hiking in the mountains in Alberta. It had this ritual feeling to it. I would leave the house early, drive an hour or two into the mountains, and spend the day walking until my feet hurt, until the trees opened up and I could see down the mountains and across the prairies, all the way back to the haze of the city from where I come. The days I spent hiking were special and singular days that felt outside of time. I shared them with friends and family, and they were deeply restorative. I never called these days Sabbath, but I knew that they were important. They made the rest of the week make sense. Looking back at these days spent in the mountains, I really don't see much of a difference between what I now refer to as my forest church and my current burgeoning Sabbath practice, except for the fact that my current practice is something that is a lot more recognizable to fellow Christians as Sabbath. If I had to pick, however, I would probably count these pre-Sabbath Sabbaths as more Sabbathy than my current Sabbath is. But I also have to keep reminding myself that the point of Sabbath isn't to make comparisons. In fact, it's kind of exactly the opposite of that. Part of my Sabbath practice is to try and take a break from comparing things to one another, as well as to try and curb my relentless self-critique. And for this reason, I don't intend to use this time to prescribe what Sabbath should look like for any one person. I'm not here to dictate whether Sabbath is a hike in the mountains or whether it's an evening curled up on the couch, whether it's 10 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon or an entire day on Sunday. Because just as open way favors orthopraxy over orthodoxy, that's why we have our shared values after all, as a community we recognize that what constitutes correct practice is as diverse as we are. The first thing I want to talk about, or the first thing I want us to think about, and I'm going to talk about it too, is this connection between God, the Sabbath, and one another. If we look broadly at the 10 Commandments within this Decalogue structure, the commandment to keep Sabbath, as we have heard, it comes after the first 3 commandments. So these first 3 commandments are, to recap, the commandment not to have any other gods before God, the commandment against idolatry, and the commandment against taking God's name in vain. The Sabbath commandment, which is the fourth commandment, operates as this hinge point between these previous 3 commandments and the following 6 commandments. 4 commandments. Oh, yeah. Okay, well, I'm missing one in there. I don't know where it went. That's fine. These 6 commandments are more outward facing. So the 6 commandments after the Sabbath commandment. They're more outward facing and they address how we should exist in community with one another. The Sabbath commandment operates literally as this bridge between our human relationship to God and our human relationship to one another. It is through observing the Sabbath, which is a rest or a pause, that we move from our relationship to God outward to our relationship to one another. So why did we choose Sabbath as one of our 7 shared practices at Open Way? According to the Open Way handbook, Sabbath is, and I quote, the practice of intentionally disrupting our normal workday rhythm for a period of rest, usually on the same day each week. Practicing Sabbath also shapes how we approach the rest of our week, decreasing stress by reminding us that God holds time, and nothing we accomplish or don't accomplish will change how God feels about us. There are a few things I really appreciate about this paragraph. I appreciate the words intentionally disrupting, for one thing. That we have to choose to enact rest in order to receive rest from God. I think it can feel kind of puzzling, but I also think that this contradiction is really important, or the seeming contradiction. The other thing I really appreciate about this paragraph is that it acknowledges that God holds time. Moreover, that God holds time in a way that is essentially mysterious to us, in a way that fully voices the already-not-yet-ness of our experience as humans on this planet. So what do I mean by this expression, already-not-yet-ness? This expression voices one of the central tensions of our faith. Many of us are familiar with the idea of already not yet. It comes from this idea that as people of God, we are always already living in God's world, a world that is at once already here in our present moment and yet still has not arrived in its fullness. For me, there's something delicious about this phrase. I love it because it should be impossible. How can something be already and at the same time not yet? But it's in that impossibility that I feel the truth of the statement. And for me, it's this embodied knowing that I can't entirely articulate, though I can feel it deeply in my gut. The covenant between God and God's people is an excellent example of this idea of already not yet. For example, God's promise is always an already and not yet moment, because it signals both to the now, to an intention that has been articulated but not yet fulfilled, as well to the ever after and the eventual fulfillment of this promise. By participating in this promise with God, we become part of the fabric of the already and the not yet. Maybe it's because as we enter into relationship with God, we begin to catch glimpses of God's kingdom, of reconciliation and peace. These visions are fleeting, but they are also sumptuous and wonderful. They produce in me a sense of longing for something I've never really known, but which feels kind of indescribably like home. I think as queer people, we are especially attuned to longing. We long for the safety and wellness of our communities and for one another. We long to enfold one another in the love that we also want for ourselves. We long for a world where we are seen and recognized and loved rather than exploited and hurt and commercialized. Longing is this experience of desire, and longing can likewise open us up to possibility, however painful that may end up being. When we practice Sabbath, we attune ourselves to longing. We open ourselves up to this possibility, and we allow ourselves to desire a world that looks and feels and is different than the world we currently inhabit. The more time we spend in the space of longing, in Sabbath, the more difficult it becomes to do nothing when we are confronted with injustice. I think there's a way that we can, or mode that we can get into when we think about rest that kind of frames it as this futile and frustrating thing. Sometimes, and especially when there's a lot going on in life, I think it can feel like being stuck in a waiting room. Sometimes I have this thought like, what does it mean to be part of a spiritual tradition that puts so much of its faith in the idea of waiting for something to come? It frustrates me so much. But I think for me, it's because I have so much automatic discomfort with the idea of passivity. I have this drive that's been drilled into me my entire life to move and change and do things. I have urgency, and that keeps me from slowing down. And this urgency, of course, it can feel urgently important sometimes. How can it not? When we look at what's happening in the world around us, and even in our own lives, the idea of rest can feel excruciating. Sometimes I wonder, can we fulfill rest? But that's also exactly the point. Sabbath asks us for one day not to fulfill a single thing. As someone with some deeply ingrained perfectionism, this is, I'm not going to lie, a terrifying thing to do. Because who am I if I'm not doing? To me, this is where Sabbath practice hits home the hardest in my sense of self-worth. What if I didn't do anything? Who would I be if I just was? Think about that for a moment. What would change for you if your sense of self didn't come from your job, or the work you did, or the things you made, or your family, or what people told you about yourself? If you just were, what would you do differently? Who would you spend time with? And how would the world look different than it does now? One of the things that's really helped me reframe, oh, I see what's happening. Okay, cool. Stay. One of the things that's helped me reframe my vision of Sabbath has been this idea that even though the Sabbath is about receiving rest, it's not inherently a passive experience. In fact, it is a deeply generative one at its core. It is time to exist that allows us to dream and imagine and create. And even if this is a deeply holy thing, Sabbath doesn't need to be a somber occasion. Think back to Genesis on the seventh day. After making all of creation, God saw that it was good, and God rested in the knowledge of that goodness. I like to think that this isn't a serious thing. God just made the world. What the heck? The world is beautiful and weird and wild, and it's the strangest thing I could possibly imagine. I like to think of God as resting and looking over God's world and laughing and marveling at the strangeness of it. I like to think of this as a joyous experience. And this experience is in fact chock full of that already-not-yet-ness, right? There is the already of the world that has been created, and then there's the not-yetness of everything that is to come as the world unfolds. And now, of course, this is not entirely good news because, as we all know, history continues to unfold in sometimes horrible and violent and oppressive ways. But think, too, of that overwhelming beauty. And think of the delight of being a creature in the world. Think of the people you love and who love you, your communities, and nature and all of its arresting beauty. Have you seen the mountains today? Have you smelled the ocean on the breeze? How can we not seek to rest deeper into these things, these beautiful creations of which we are also a part? How can this not be a source of profound joy for us? When we take the time to delight in these things, when our observation of the Sabbath allows us to connect more deeply to our created world and reflect on our created natures in this world, any number of things can happen. One of the things that becomes possible when we observe Sabbath is that we are given eyes to better see and behold our world. And along with the beauty and plenitude of creation, this seeing includes seeing what is not right. It's the not yet in our already. I know that this community cares deeply about co-creating a just and loving world, and that's one of the things I love about this community. One of the ways we can continue to do this is through first seeing the world for what it is, which is at once so beautiful and also so broken in so many ways. And here I mean broken in the ways that actually count, like climate disaster and apartheid and fascism and violence, the limiting of trans rights, the exploitation of vulnerable people, not in that kind of hand-wringing evangelical sense of the word, where it usually points to sexual immorality and perceived attacks against Christian society. Sexual immortality would be fascinating. I'm going to be thinking about that. But anyway, I'm not talking about sexual immorality here. I'm talking about the important things. Once we see the brokenness, the real brokenness, and let it really sink in, once we allow ourselves to rest and imagine how things can be different, once we have the time to encounter one another and form relationships built on love and solidarity, that's when we will begin to enact the already and our not yet. So, what are some practical things that we can do, both individually and as a congregation, to honor rest? As I mentioned at the top of the sermon, I don't think it's particularly meaningful to ask everyone to observe a traditional entire Sunday Sabbath. As much as an entire day of rest can be transformative and revelatory, we can't ignore the realities of our daily lives, which may include appointments, jobs, extracurricular activities, housework, family, any number of emergencies or unexpected events. However, I think there are ways that we can practice rest that holds the spirit of Sabbath. And these practices can likewise open us up to the already-not-yet-ness of our lives as people of God. These commitments can be small, starting with a short period of time every day or even every week, where you just don't allow yourself to do any work or even think about work. What happens when you give yourself space to just be? An important part of this practice, I think, is in the noticing. When you move away from your to-do list and your schedule, who are you? What do you want to do? At risk of sounding like a therapist, how does that feel in your body? Do you want to move your body, or do you want to practice stillness? Do you want to read a book or just zone out and let your mind wander? Part of your practice may involve tapping into your self-knowledge in order to learn what your body and soul needs on any given day or at any given time. As a congregation, I think we have a responsibility to hold one another with the same kind of love with which God holds us, the kind of love that we experience through Sabbath. This means that we hold one another in rest, facilitate opportunities for our community to rest and play together, and acknowledge the world that we are working towards together. Are there ways that we can introduce the already into our collective not yet? How can we move together in love towards a world that is full and beautiful and well-rested, where everyone has the opportunity to taste the feast that is the Sabbath? How do we live more like Jesus, who purposefully lived a life that wasn't defined or dictated by his job as a carpenter, who instead called others away from their work and into not only rest, but also purposeful and loving community with one another? Jesus understood that we are so much more than our work, that in rest, we, along with all of creation, are good just as we are. And so with all of that being said, may we all be given the rest that we need. May we all glimpse the not yet that is to come. And may we be so privileged to do this with one another and with God. May we all receive the Sabbath feast. Thank you.